So welcome back. Now we're going to move into political economy. If identities are shaped by culture, then arguably both are a function to some extent or another of political economy. For example, we'd probably expect the culture of an agrarian state, like Zimbabwe, to be different than one of a highly urban state, like Singapore. So again, think about how traditional survival cultures versus secular, rational, and self-expression cultures might be more likely to prosper in one than in the other. Okay? So we're going to start off by talking a little bit about the markets. And this is a very basic understanding of this. Markets are defined as the interaction between the forces of supply and demand, which results in the allocation of resources. There is a constant interaction between these. So very basically, if you are a producer, the higher the price you can get for something, the more of it you want to produce. Now, if you're a consumer, the lower the price you can get, the more you're going to want to buy. This curve shows the relationship where supply and demand come together to determine the market price. Okay. Now it's going to vary, and so here you've got how much is being produced. Sorry, I should have initially focused over here. So they're going to want to produce a lot. Oh no, I just lost my little pointer. There we go. They're going to want to produce a lot at a high price, but consumers are going to want to buy a lot at a low price. So again, where supply and demand hit, this is going to be the best market price. Now, of course, we'd expect BMWs to be somewhere over here with low demand and high prices. Okay, so the supply curve would be up here. This would be keeps disappearing. This is where you would have the price equilibrium with respect to BMWs. Now, with respect to toothbrushes, the curve would be more down here. So there would be cheaper toothbrushes, and there'd be much more demand for these toothbrushes. Okay. The market mechanisms determine the goods available and the price we pay for them. And here we'd like to talk, of course, in a liberal state about the invisible hand, these natural processes where somehow the businesses figure out how much to produce and what price it is, then the consumers will actually determine what they're willing to pay for it and how much they're willing to buy it. And then this reaches some sort of equilibrium. So as the supply goes up disproportionately to demand, prices are going to fall. Okay, so if the supply is up here and demand is down here, well, then the price is going to have to come down to meet where people are willing to pay for it. The more there is of something holding demand constant, the less it's going to be worth. It's not scarce. The advantage of a monopoly is that you can keep the supply low to keep prices high. Okay? So cartels do this by including enough members to have a major market share. For example, OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. They have a majority share of the market, and they can limit output in order to keep prices high. As demand increases, prices increase, which prompts producers to produce more, right? Because as people are willing to pay more, they're willing to produce more because they're going to sell more stuff for a higher price. Of course, there's always a delicate balance, because if they produce too much, then they're hurting themselves. They're going to drive prices down. So here's an example, a couple examples for you. I bought a Honda Civic in the summer of 2006. It's getting a little bit old. The economy was still good. Of course, this was fictitious. Gas prices were rising, and so there was high demand for an efficient car like the Honda Civic. This meant that supply couldn't keep up, and they could charge a premium. There wasn't a discount to be found. I could have sat in that little Honda dealership for days, and I wouldn't have gotten a discount. Now, if I'd waited 3 years, I would have gotten a great deal. Because at that point, we had the financial collapse, well, the slowdown, whatever you want to call it. No one had money, so there was very little demand for the cars. There was a high supply of cars. They were sitting there on the lots, and this meant that the dealerships were cutting prices. It also meant they were cutting the supply. And by cutting the supply, that gradually moves it back to market equilibrium. By cutting the supply, gradually they're going to get prices that are more reasonable from their end. It means a little more expensive for our end, but not as expensive as it was when there was very limited supply. Second example, you can see my house on the right. Just kidding, it's not my house. I bought a house at the exact worst time, and it's not as beautiful as that, so I won't even put up the picture there. It was, according to One Real Estate, about 12 days before the market peaked in 2006. I did a lot of dumb financial things in 2006. This was irrational, right? I was tired of being a nomad. I had a couple dogs, wanted a good school for my daughter, even though she had 3 more years before she'd even start school. But my irrational desire to buy a house was matched by the irrational desire of others to buy. It's the best investment you can make. That's what people used to say. And so there was competition for every house. Okay, and that kept the prices very high. My irrational desire was also matched by the irrational desire of greedy bankers and underwriters to give me a loan that maybe I didn't deserve. Oh, my dog's eating the pen. Hold on. Sorry. Hey. Sorry. If I was in class, my dog wouldn't be eating the pen right now, right? At least I wouldn't see it. So what you had was an artificially high demand and a relatively limited supply. So it was a boom for real estate agents and bankers who ensured that the market would be loaded with demand by giving bad loans to people who didn't qualify. And I did technically qualify, just for the record. I shouldn't have been paying that much. Okay. So these are my dogs. These were my dogs. Great dogs. Okay. No longer with us. Very sad. So going back to the supply-demand curve brings up another element, competition. Again, people seek to buy the most, my little pointer, for as cheap as they can. Okay? Different sellers for any given good compete for clients, which prompts innovation as people try to corner a market or their niche in a market. Need to think of something better or a different way to lower costs in order to be truly competitive. It's conceptually simple, but practically it's very complicated. It's a very delicate process, which means that markets are very strong forces and difficult to regulate. Think about trying to regulate the labor market. People hire illegal labor, undocumented workers, to get around labor laws like sick time, overtime, minimum wage. Think about trying to regulate trade. Think about medicine. You can regulate trade here, but people will go to Canada to buy cheaper versions or locally unavailable generics. Trying to regulate wages. You can try to cap executive pay. Sounds fair to me, but the counter argument is that it leads to a lack of incentive for people to take those demanding jobs. Take that with a grain of salt in some cases. But the point is it's a delicate balancing act. So now let's go through some definitions here. Property is defined as the ownership of goods and services. We could talk about sort of standard property, real estate, my DVD player, MP3 player, everything that plays music. We could talk about non-material forms or non-tangible forms of property, especially intellectual property, a key one. Software protection. It's not about protecting the physical disk a song or software is on. It's about the knowledge or the content, so that others don't steal that. Intellectual property rights are very hard to enforce because they're so easy to violate. And it's something that the U.S. cares a lot about because we are such a hotbed of intellectual production. We produce ideas that can be easily stolen. And I'm sure most of you have stolen some intellectual property out there, right? If you look at your MP3 player, I don't want to draw any conclusions. So, in some ways, though, this is an ethical question. Is it fair that someone in Cambodia should have to pay the same price for the software as someone in America who earns 10 times more? It would be very difficult to try to regulate this and try to sell at a cheaper price in Cambodia because then middlemen would come in, they'd buy them at that cheaper price, and they'd still sell them in the United States for cheaper. The dog got the pen again, sorry. Okay, so this brings up important ethical questions. The next definition, private goods, are based on property rights. Okay, these are goods that are owned by an individual or group of individuals for their own use. Private goods, unlike public goods, which we talked about before and we'll come back to today, are divisible and excludable. Someone can own 1 or 1,000 cars, meaning that someone else cannot own that one or those 1,000 cars. Real estate is divisible. I own my house. No one else can. Same with the dollar. By contrast, in comparative politics, we often speak of public goods, those available for society. They're indivisible and non-excludable. Anyone in the public can benefit from them. They're very hard to restrict. They tend to be goods that everyone wants, but no one wants to, and few can, pay for them themselves. Things like defense, right? I would love to protect the borders, but I just can't do it on my own. Okay? Roads. I need to drive to work, but I can't pave the roads myself. Healthcare, education, police force, fire departments. Often there's an outcry when you begin to charge for these goods because people expect them. These are public goods. People expect them from the state. When we talk about social expenditures, we're talking about the state's provision of public benefits, from roads and education and submarine-based missiles to Social Security pensions and Medicaid. There's always a question of who benefits from these expenditures. Okay? Is it fair that old people still pay high taxes in Howard County to maintain the good school system there, but then they don't use that school system? So lots of questions about social expenditures, which are fundamental to the political process. Taxes are revenue sources through which the state can provide social expenditures. You can't expend money if you don't have an income, right? You need taxes. A deficit is how much we owe in a given year, how much the state owes in a given year when the budget isn't balanced. Expenditures exceed revenues. That leads to a deficit. A debt, by contrast, very important to understand the difference, is the total amount the state is in the red. It's a product of deficits and government borrowing over however many years it's gone on for. When you have a debt, this is everything you owe, not just what you owe for a given fiscal year. The central bank is the institution that's responsible for stabilizing the value of the currency. And they do this through two means. First, by regulating the national interest rate, making savings more or less profitable, and indirectly by affecting the money supply through this. The more money there is available in the market, the cheaper the currency is. And the second method is by directly regulating the supply of money, by printing bills when they want to. So money is a medium of economic transactions. There is no value in and of itself. Money doesn't have a value. It's just pieces of paper. Well, there are metals and paper, and these things actually cost. The U.S. Mint actually loses money producing pennies and nickels. It costs about 2 cents to make a penny and about 10 cents to make a nickel. Okay. Value, though, is based on the assumption that everyone will put a similar value on this money, which in turn depends on the state's ability to interfere in the economy directly, as I described above, through the interest rate or regulating the supply of money, and indirectly, things like political stability, the economic solvency of the state. Can the state pay its bills when it needs to? If you loan money to the state, will the state be able to repay you when you want? And these are called bonds. So our central bank, which hopefully you know, is called the Federal Reserve. Okay. In Europe, they're often called the central bank, the Central Bank of England, for example. So I want to highlight one more time the notion of what the central bank, the functions of the central bank. Again, it can regulate the national interest rate by making savings more or less profitable. The higher the interest rate is, what's going to happen? Well, if the interest rate is high, then people are going to want to save their money. They're going to put the money in the bank where they're going to get a high return on their money. Put in $100 with a 5% interest rate, you're going to get $105 at the end of the year. If it's a 1% rate, you're only going to get $101. So if the Fed wants, if the central bank wants to encourage people to go out and put money into the economy, take money out of their bank accounts and spend the money, then it's going to lower interest rates. So that, what's the point of putting $100 in there if I'm only going to get 101 at the end of the day? It makes more sense if I'm going to get 105, right? But if I'm only going to get 101, I might as well go out and buy that nice MP3 player I've been looking at for so long, so I can download my illegal music onto it. So that's an important point. And the other point that I want to go over one more time is its ability to regulate the supply of money. Keep in mind that the more money the central bank produces, the less that money is worth. Right? The scarcer something is, the more it's worth. The more it is, the more of it there is out there, the less it's worth. And we'll talk about inflation in a couple minutes. So here's the economic crisis abridged. As we went into the economic crisis, the government brought interest rates down to unprecedented levels, at one point practically giving money away. The purpose was to encourage low-cost lending by other banks, to get more money out there on the market, into our hands, right? I've got more money. There's no point in me saving the money, so I'm going to start spending it. People start spending, and producers find it profitable to produce more. And then, of course, they can hire more people. So my house cost a lot in 2006. And then it lost a lot in 2007, 2008. No one wants to buy my neighbor's houses, which makes me feel poor. So I'm out of the market. I'm not going to buy big stuff. No vacations, no expensive restaurants, no babysitters. Right? You guys, if you babysit, you're expensive. Companies on the market, in return, feel poor because I'm not buying the stuff that they produce. So Bud over there gets laid off because his company is not selling very much, so they don't need him to produce anything anymore. Well, this leads to a vicious circle. More people feel poor, right? And as more people feel poor, well, then they're not out there buying stuff. And as they're not out there buying stuff, then more and more people lose their jobs, etc. And so this is a problem. So one of the things the Fed did was it lowered its interest rates. And the government did something else. It stimulated the economy by dropping lots of money into it, right? Investing in General Motors, for example. Banks no longer felt so poor, so they started giving loans again. So people would go out and they'd buy those houses and cars and make home improvements. And then I started spending money happily, just like in the good old days. And since I was spending money happily, then Bud got his job back, and he got to spend like the good old days too. And all that made things better, or it was supposed to. Okay, and so there are arguments of to what extent this has been helpful and what it hasn't done. Now, the risk on the part of the Federal Reserve, our central bank, is that if you have cheap credit, you can have too much money out there, right? If the percentage rate is low and we're going to take our money out of the banks and start spending it, well, we're putting a lot of money into the economy, and this can lead to inflation. We've got so many dollars on the market that they lose their value, which means that savings dry up. So sorry, I should have showed you this slide before. Take a look at it. Pause if you will. Move on. Inflation is defined as sustained rapid increase in the general price level as measured by some broad index number of prices, mirrored in the correspondingly decreasing purchasing power of our currency. In other words, things are going up in price and our currency is worth less. Hyperinflation is defined as more than 50% inflation per month for more than 2 months. This usually occurs when governments need money and they can't get it from the market. In other words, no one's going to lend them money. That means that we're not buying government bonds. And so instead, they print it. They make their central bank print the money. This brings lots of money into the market, into the economy, and lowers the value of the money. Okay? If you have expensive credit, people don't borrow. They don't spend. Right? Instead, they save their money. But again, if they're not buying stuff, if demand is low and producers are going to cut back or quit, producers are going to cut back what they're producing, they're going to quit producing. This leads to unemployment. Okay, so for government, this is a very delicate balancing act. For the central bank, this is a very delicate balancing act. And often central banks are independent, as our central bank is. So going back to, I'll take inflation in a different slide. Sorry.